Hi everyone, welcome. My name's Olivia Ahern. I'm the curator of exhibitions at Nottingham Contemporary. And tonight it's my pleasure to welcome you all to Roots and Weeds with Jason Allen-Paisant and Mina Gorji. This is the second event of our second series of Five Bodies live readings, an online program of poetry, writing and text. All of this season's Five Bodies events are organised under the theme of entanglements, and they investigate poetic ecologies in the Anthropocene, opening up new conversations around coexistence, resilience, and sustainability. For those of you tuning in for the first time, Nottingham Contemporary is a contemporary art centre based in the East Midlands. We work with artists, communities, and academics to reflect on contemporary art, society, and visual cultures. Five Bodies was imagined in conjunction with our colleagues Sarah Jackson and Dr. Linda Kemp from the Critical Poetics Research Group at Nottingham Trent University. Tonight's event includes AI-driven live captioning, which can be accessed via a link in the YouTube chat. And this will open in a separate window on your browser. And within that, you can adjust the scale and the layout to suit your requirements. And now to our speakers this evening. I'm delighted to introduce Jason Allen-Paisant and Mina Gorji. Jason is a scholar and writer whose work explores embodied experience in the context of Afro-diasporic politics and world building. His most recent works reflect on the complex meanings of nature and Black life. His critically acclaimed collection, Thinking with Trees, published by Carcanet Press, has been praised as a bold and impressive debut by The Guardian and as expansive, fracturing, subversive book by the Irish Times. His work has also appeared in Granta, The Guardian, the Poetry Review, Callaloo, the BBC and other venues. And he's been the recipient of a prestigious Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship. Jason holds a doctorate in medieval and modern languages from the University of Oxford and now works as a lecturer in poetry and decolonial thought at the University of Leeds. He's also currently developing a nonfiction book entitled Primitive Child on Blackness, landscape and reclaiming time. Joining Jason this evening, I'm also delighted to welcome writer and poet Mina Gorji. Mina was born in Iran and lives in Cambridge, where she is Associate Professor at the Faculty of English at University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Pembroke College. Her debut, Art of Escape, published by Carcanet in 2020, a Telegraph Book of the Month, has been described as a collection of exquisite miniatures that suggest worlds by Fiverr Book, Best Poetry Books of 2020, and intricate, considered poems which encourage us to democratize our attention and empathy by The Guardian. She's published poems in Poetry Review, Magma, and the Forward Book of Poetry, amongst others. She has also written a study of John Clare's poetry and essays on weeds, rudeness, little things, and listening. A lyric critical essay, Listening for Stars, was published in Poetry Review in autumn 2021, and her second poetry collection, Scale, will be published by Carcanet in July later this year. In terms of the running order of tonight's event, Mina and Jason are going to read for around 15 minutes each. They'll then be in conversation together before each giving us a final few poems. Following that, I'll be joining them both to field any questions you might have. So please do send through any thoughts or questions via the YouTube chat, and I'll keep an eye on that throughout the evening. And now I'll hand over to Mina for the first few readings.
Thank you for coming along, and thanks to Olivia for inviting me and for this opportunity to read and think and talk with Jason, whose work I admire. We've been thinking about roots and weeds, not just in terms of botany, but as a figure of consciousness, exploring the way they bring into form and focus questions of place and belonging. Ideas both Jason and I are both concerned with in different ways in our poems. I'll be reading from my first collection, Art of Escape, and some new poems from my forthcoming collection, Scale, which is out later this year. I'm excited to be able to think together with Jason this evening and with you about roots and weeds. And I'd like to invite you to join the conversation in the chat and in the Q&A session at the end. What does it mean to be rooted, to have roots? What are we rooted to? Where do our roots extend? How far down? How far across? How far back in space, in time? What is it to be rootless? Does a migrant have roots? What is our relationship to the earth? Do we feel the ground with our feet, with our hands, with our whole bodies? Do we feel a connection to the earth? I wanted to start with an image that has raised some of these questions for me. It's a picture of a hippo. It's the skeleton of a hippo that I encountered here in Cambridge in a museum, in fact, where I live, near where I live. And the hippo, which I think you can see now, was discovered only a few miles from Cambridge in the chalk pits in a village called Barrington. We don't tend to think of hippos as native English creatures, but they were 125,000 years ago. Hippos wallowed in the river shallows. This hippo asked me to think again about what I understood native to mean. What is a native creature? According to which scale of time? And this question has been one I've been exploring in my poetry, in my collection Scale. And the first poem I'd like to read isn't a hippo poem. I haven't written that poem yet. It's about a local chalk pit, though, and the bones that I discovered there, fossil bones. I wanted to think about what those bones might be telling us, what bones can tell us, the colour of bones, the evidence of bones. What about the history of climate or climate change, of how something or someone lived or died? Variations in white. April hedges in flower, wheat is ankle high. Follow the green rose into spring until the ground opens sudden into chalk, and sliding down the quarry side, shoes, hands, faces disappear in white. We found the bones in chalk, fossil bones, hard as flint. Time opens up, imagining the marrow slowly hollowing, the hollow turning slowly white. Not grinding stone, charred pot or knife unearthed from some ancient site, a human femur, fractured but healed, revealing someone stayed behind, binding the wound, tending the fallen, trace of being civilized, evidence of bones. The colour of bones isn't fixed. In the living body, slightly pink, blanched in an X-ray, freshly dried, bright white, yellowing with age, combusts to grey, sometimes with reddish patches, darkening to black, the hottest flame burns white. I want to shift from hot to extreme cold now and to think again about bones, our bones and the bones of a wolf. In ice they found a wolf intact, its face and fur still legible after 40,000 years. Cold preserves the living for a time, slowing the heart to almost still. Snow will fall, covering our tracks. Ice crystallize inside our bones. What can survive the glacier? I'm interested in what happens to ideas of roots and the native, to the idea of belonging when we shift the scale of our thinking, shift the scale of time from a tiny mouse at the edge of a volcano to the slow movement of rock formations, the time of a mouse's heartbeat to deep time, geological time. The next poem begins at the edge of a volcano and thinks about the creatures that make their homes in this extreme and precarious terrain. And it goes on to remember the extinct volcanoes in England, in the Lake District, and to think about the plants and creatures that are native there. Daffodils, for instance, which were in fact brought over by the colonisers, Roman soldiers, and are now thought of as native plants. Field notes from the edge of a volcano. Pinatuba mouse. Is the ground warm? Does your heart sense the volcano's rhythms? How do you know when to run? Darwin's racer. You have no natural predators on Volcano Island. Only the volcano. Now in the blue light the world is quiet. The amaryllis opened overnight, 3 flowers, pinkish red, quietly look out. The tiny flies around its stalk are sitting still. In England, the volcanoes are extinct. They have been naturalised to beauty spots, a landscape for adventurers to scale and to admire, Acadian folds erupting into daffodils. Underneath, a memory of fire solidified, hematite, cobalt, graphite, magnetite. The rocks are moving at a different scale. The daffodils beside the lake were brought here by the Romans, some say for their healing powers. What is a native plant? According to which scale of time? Triassic ferns, flowerless, rows of russet spores, braille to the wind. Pleistocene fir trees sending pollen into future air, into a forest where wolves will track the footprints of 2 children abandoned in the dark. At night, the sky is glittering with sparks. Between the darkness and the dark, the planets with their quiet moons appear. The next poem is about a plant often considered a weed, the Oxford ragwort. It was brought to this country by botanists from the slopes of Mount Etna and planted in the Botanic Gardens in Oxford, from which it soon escaped. People often talk about urbanisation and industrialisation destroying the natural world, but this ragwort thrived in the conditions brought by industrialisation, the coming of the railways in particular. Train tracks are lined with clinker, a material which is very similar to the volcanic earth on the slopes of Mount Etna. It's also a plant which thrived, this is the ragwort, in the burnt earth of bomb craters during the war. So this is a poem about resilience. Oxford ragwort. From Etna's cinder slopes to the botanic gardens, Senecio squalidus escaped. It slipped out of its cultivated bed, the ancient cemetery walls, the city's bounds, following the gaps in paving stones, the new laid tracks of railway lines, southeast along the clinker beds, into the heart of London, bomb craters, burnt out scrubland, scorch earth again. The next poem turns its focus to the skies and thinks about the stars. It emerged after I went to see a star map in the Institute of Astronomy near where I live, and I realised for the first time that the constellations we see are different depending on where we stand on the Earth, different in the northern and southern hemispheres. So it's a poem about that and about what star maps reveal and don't reveal about space and distance. Scale. The map reveals so many stars, 2 constellations in the shape of bears, a peacock parvo in the southern hemisphere, the spaces between galaxies, the emptiness, the not quite emptiness. It doesn't show the single atom H in every cubic meter, the atom that is not quite still. How cold it is between the galaxies. The snowdrops in the garden, the morning after frost. Quite a few of the poems in my collection explore temperature, its experience and effects. I suppose we're all preoccupied with temperature at the moment. And the next poem thinks about those creatures adapted to extreme cold. Cold. At the bottom of the Arctic brittle stars, the temperature is permanently low, or has been until now. So little light. Currents carry whale song far away, and far below, bristleworms, anemones, occasionally crabs, and eyeless creatures moving slow, untouched by light, invisible to stars. Imagine floating in Andromeda between 2 distant stars. Temperature of emptiness. A family of field mice huddling against the cold. Newt is at the edge of life, waiting for the temperature to rise. This little stillness leaves us cold. Another thing I'm interested in is how a migrant experiences temperature and temperature difference. My grandmother arrived on these shores from Madras in South India, and this next poem is about her experience. I was thinking about the shock of that first winter in this country and remembering that she always felt cold here. Waiting for snow, we feel instead the emptiness of rain. Inside the house, it's cold. We have been waiting for the world to be forgiven for a moment into white. The pavement glitters, crystalline with ice. Grandmother had never felt the snow before. She knew the touch of monsoon rain, humidity so thick the body slowed, before the shock of Edinburgh rain, soaking her sari with its cold and grey. This last poem is about a bird that has become native to southwest London, where I grew up and where my parents live. Parakeet. Flash of green up in the silver birch, neon squawking gaudy green against the dappled quiet of suburbia, its lawnmowers and distant radios. Thanks very much. Over to Jason now.
Thank you so much, Mina. It is a pleasure being here and reading with you, listening to your poems and the wonderful, vivid commentary you make around them. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. I wanted to show an image of a fallen beach that I took a photo of in Roundhay Park. I don't know if you can see, but the roots are it's the upturned roots, the intricacy of the roots, how they weave above and under each other, and how big the base of that tree, constituted by the fallen by the upturned roots, is. I was quite impressed by this, and it inspired me. It inspired quite a bit of thinking about roots, about entanglement, and just about all that we do not see, all of the tree that is actually, all that is actually not visible, but which is so vital to the tree, to us. Then at the base, behind what you now see, there seems to be an entire world. The pattern of the soil, the elevations that look like cliffs or giant rocks seem to be a miniature of other landscapes, a miniature of mountains. It's such a world, such a huge world that I found right there. And I think that there's such a sense of an apprehension of time scales, long time scales, when you're standing in front of a thing like that. But I want to start with, I know we'll be talking a little bit more about that. I want to start with a poem, which is the second poem in my book. It's called Naming. It's called Naming, and it's in 3 parts. Naming. 1. In the wood I hear the beautiful call of bird I do not know. I wish I knew the names of birds and could identify them by their songs. It would be so much nicer to say I heard the warble of a wood pigeon as the red floor of the woodland stretched before me like an avenue through the high rises of beeches and oaks. As I walk on the path and feel the soft cushion, feel my foot press down into the flesh of the duff. Because a name is reassurance, a comfort in the flesh to hold these songs in the trees, so something could be mine. Warble, trill, bell, fluting, something nearly right. 2. The urge I feel is to give things names, but everything is already named. The urge I feel is to connect with this land, these plants, birds, songs, these trees. To name things would be perverse. Perhaps the place within will always escape the name. In the mind one leaves, and leaves, but on stone, earth, and grass one stays forever. I have a few trees on my tongue, oak, maple, birch. I have a few birds on my tongue, seagull, mallard, redbreast. I have a few plants on my tongue, rhododendron, English ivy, iris. I have started to see that nothing is itself. Everything turns to something else, like birch bark becoming ves de loup. I prefer the sound of my wife's ancestors, the ashes of their throat, like the rhododendrons becoming fighting pythons, and me gathering chestnuts, like the rhododendron barks becoming fighting pythons, and me gathering chestnuts for dinner, in a stream that dips below ground and re-emerges often. This life I no longer know. 3. When I go walking in Malham, there is still that part of me that didn't want to come, that doesn't want to be in this land of Carrymore jackets. All I can handle is nature under fingernails, my grandmother planting Negro yams, shaping the land. All I can handle is the landscape within me, not scenery spread out on a canvas. A lot of my work is about time. I reflect a lot about time and how to make sense of time in our bodies in the context of history. But the woodland is such a generative space for thinking about time and dwelling in and with different rhythms of time. And certainly that tree is one such experience, the experience of looking at it and thinking about process, trying to grasp a sense of the process of our own bodies, the processes of change, the processes by which we become inextricably interlinked with the biosphere, with the ecology that seems to be outside of us but is very much a part of us. And these next two poems, Leisure, come out of a thinking around what we lose in the experience of racism when the body is subject to the daily assaults of racism. What does that experience do to us in our relationship to time? I think it robs us of time in a sense. There's a sort of immobilization, a kind of stuckness that can be produced when one has to be constantly responding to provocation, to hurt, to anger and so on. There's a sort of negative energy that is produced, and that robs us of the opportunity of various different opportunities of occupying our moment. And so leisure, there is part 1 and part 2. I'll read both of them. Leisure 1. The sun splashes its light on the trees. Their exposed skins glisten. Inside me, a living thing is ripening. In this month of December, when night falls in early afternoon, it is a struggle to get here. And now I am here, and now that I am here, I am living. A sadness returns, a sadness for the boy I once was. What was my poverty? Was it living in a space that was too little? To go far might have been just to enter the woods behind the house, but there was a wall separating me from it. Leisure, part 2. Our ancestors' bodies were property. We've carried that knowledge with us. You will find it in our saying, Chicken Mary, hark the near. Happy children, be wary. The hawk is always round the corner. People who live in the wake of slavery and plantation, we know we must always be on guard. There's something about containment, self-policing, about not being able to totally let go. Deep down, we know that that ability to occupy your space, to look at the world from inside yourself rather than at yourself from the outside, is also about time. To occupy space is to occupy time. Even as a child, you internalize that your life is less deserving of time than the lives of others, that for you, time is never to be wasted, that your life is marked by doing, working, and at a certain point, this word begins to hover above you, around you. You hear it on television. You learn it as a concept. You can't remember when or where you first heard it. Leisure. Only certain people have it. Do they have it because they can name it, the way Westerners name ideas and turn them into money? And now you must unlearn this learning. Learn to carry your body with the confidence of those entitled to time. I'm going to read a couple of short poems that are about the joy of being in the woods or in the park, green space, as we say. And the first one is called Spring, simply spring. Happy children in predictable hordes take the way home that goes through the park, because the sun is out and because of you, galaxies of sepals changing into masked nights. Daffodils. Speculation on future blackness. It's time to write about daffodils again, to hear a different sound from the word daffodil. Imagine daffodils in the corner of a sound system in Clapham. Can't you? Well, you must try to imagine daffodils in the hands of a black family on a black walk in spring. Among the great oaks in autumn. Among the oaks, my skin is a type of bark. I give birth to rocks. The same thing that happens to me happens to them. A leaf will flutter down my roots and into another world, turning to ghosts, creeping back as the light goes low. I am painted dancers sprouting from the vines. The strings of my body vibrate to the strings of the rain. Just doing a time check to see how much of my time I've used up. So just time for one more short poem. And it's a poem that's going to be published in a forthcoming anthology of Black British writing. It's called More Fire, an anthology of Black British writing. And the poem is called Learning Birdsong. Verbs clear the head and enter the flesh. Birds are nearer, nouns the spirits of occasions. I catch a song and 5 others escape. A noun cannot hold the sound of birds. The woodland always is poem awaiting. Do not forget this. Okay, so shall we have a conversation? Mina, see. I think you're on mute.
Forgive me. I was saying, yes, please, let's have a conversation. And that was wonderful to hear you and wonderful to hear your poems.
Likewise.
Yeah, and yeah, I was so interested in the idea of naming also in your poems, and the sounds of the idea of naming as a kind of, is it a kind of possession or a kind of yeah, I was wondering if there are some of the which kinds of birds, might be seeming. Were there any birds which seemed to be local birds here, which were also local in other places, like where you were growing up, or if there were any crossover birds, like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about blackbirds and robins, and they where
Yeah.
they are. I know that nightingales live. I was shocked to hear nightingales live across the world. Actually, they're not just not well. I knew that, yeah. Or a lot of the garden birds we have in this country are international. So I wondered if any of the woodland birds were, and if you
Mm-hmm.
thought about that.
Yeah, I actually the parakeet is a bird that I knew from Jamaica. I
Aha.
was quite surprised to hear that
Oh yeah.
it had become um, common in London
Oh
as
yeah.
well, I think is what you said.
Yeah, they're all over southwest London, southeast London. They're in the trees and in the silver birch trees along the river with the pigeons. They're like they're flying in formations across the suburban gardens. Yeah, it's amazing. They're definitely local London birds now. But I think it was like since the late 19th century, a couple of them escaped. I think they were, I don't know, uh,
Yeah.
but
Oh,
I didn't know they were in Jamaica.
yeah. Yeah, we
Huh.
have those in Jamaica as well. And when I think of parakeet, I just think of the birds that we and my friends and I used to um, you know shoot. We used to go bird hunting, shoot birds with a slingshot,
Oh no.
which is
Oh no.
which is that I've got to be honest that's perhaps that was our way of learning about birds. I'd love to hear what other people have, if there are people who have that experience. I don't know, the people from the Caribbean might be aware of that. Um I first was exposed to bird watching when I came to live in Europe. That was never a thing back home. I suppose we have a more of a um, what should I say, practical. I mean, we see birds as food.
Parakeets as well.
I don't no, I don't think parakeets.
Oh.
I remember the bald pate, which is a bird endemic to the Americas. But
Hmm.
I you perhaps won't be surprised to hear that I've been learning the names of birds, which is what the poem is about. That's what it begins to. That's the launching off point of the poem, to talk about a different relationship to, and I use this, the word in inverted commas, nature, a different relationship to the space. Nature in a more, as a sort of a romantic sense of a place that you go into to, whether it's is it to find yourself or to go walking or that sort of thing. And there's a lot that comes with that for me. I mean, all of that to say that where I'm from, we people have a different relationship to what's called nature here. So that a lot of my, anyway, I don't want to, I want to hear you talk a little bit about that. I just to say that I was struck by your poems. I love variations in white. I'm looking at the form of your poems, which I realize that people might not be seeing. I realize that your lines tend to be very short.
Yeah.
I'm struck by that.
Yeah.
Struck by some lines are just one word, and I wonder whether the tightness of that has to do with the individual word. That's something that you might be doing with the word itself. What do you think?
Yeah, the words that come just in one line,
Mm-hmm.
they have to stand up to a lot. They have to stand up to a lot because they've been given the whole line. But I think I was trying to create a kind of space around the words or the word, and trying to let the words, to see those words and to hear those words in a kind of space which we tend not to experience them in that way in conversation or in longer sentences. I find like a long form of a 5-stress iambic pentameter line very long. I don't think I can write. It's very difficult for me to write such long. So I think I was trying to carve away and give space, and it's like a give air to let it resonate, let it open in a certain way. And the short lines, it puts a lot of pressure on each word, but it also lets it open in a certain way and sound. I hope. And that poem, I think it was to do with tiny, discovering things in chalk, white things in white chalk, and tiny incremental changes. And I think maybe that was part of what I was trying to do with the form, and have tiny movements like that. So it gave a sense of, maybe in that poem, a kind of digging and tunneling, or a kind of going down.
Yes.
And so it was a kind of digging, in a way, that poem into these tiny differences in the colour, white, between chalk, between bone, shades of bone, trying to think about those smallest changes and how meaningful they are. So, like, if you're an archaeologist, there's an amazing scale, a bone scale. I don't know what it's actually called, but archaeologists have a bone scale, and there are these, like, it's like I don't know, each shade means something. Like, burnt in this way, this is what this, at this time. It's a kind of decoding of the of the smallest shades, from bright white, all the way through to charred black, and then each one has a kind of. So I was interested in the language of those incremental shifts in color, but also how we might create a kind of an experience of that, maybe in words. I don't know, in tiny.
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me.
I hope so.
Because there's also like a feeling of it being a series of vignettes as well.
Yeah.
Seems quite in line with what you're doing.
Yeah.
Which is probably a sort of looking at the thing from different angles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps like a series of cinematic snapshots.
Maybe, yeah. And I was interested in short forms, like haiku, for instance, or short, how can you, what are the, I haven't written actual haikus, but I'm interested in reading them, and in the, condensation of things into the smallest possible space. Maybe, I don't know if that has anything to do with what you can carry in a small space if you've experienced migration, what you get used, the idea of how small things, carry a lot, memories, associations. You can't take everything with you when you leave somewhere. So I don't know if that spareness has something to do with that also, that perhaps, I don't know, I haven't thought about that properly. But yeah, thanks for the question, Jason.
Well, that's deeply fascinating. That idea of the space of the poem as being a sort of like some sort of visual representation of holding migration and and what sort of space we can hold, both culturally
Yes.
and mentally.
Yes.
So I think
Yeah.
it's a
What
really
space we
fascinating
can
idea.
hold, and the time, the space of, yeah, there's a kind of sticking together in the family or in a small community, and not spreading out in a certain way when you first come to a place, I think. And I don't know, I'm wondering about when you can relax enough to put your roots down into a new place, when you can feel rooted in a different way in another country. Yeah, I mean, the seeds that come here from all over the world, they root here too, but for a person, when they can feel part of the soil, part of the place, part of the ecosystem. Yeah, I don't know. So maybe it takes a little bit
I
longer.
wonder how time comes into that for you.
Yeah, how time comes in.
To the into this issue of roots, which you did a wonderful um, series of declensions on this idea of roots at the beginning.
Oh, thanks.
I just,
Yeah.
in as it relates to the migratory experience and roots in that sense, I wondered how we might think time.
Yeah, how long it takes to root, how deep. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't. That's a good question. I
Yeah.
suppose I was interested in how, over a very long space of time, the roots are stranger than you think, and things are more connected and entangled maybe than we might have thought, and that, you know, the thing that looks like displacement might not be displacement, and the thing that looks like out of place might not be, if we look at it differently. So that's why I was interested in the shifting timescales. I know you talked about time too, and the feeling. I was interested to hear more about what you were saying about the experience of the body and in time. You talked about that in one of your poems, the feeling of the bodies in the context of history and the different rhythms of time.
Yeah, well, I think about that devastating founding experience of slavery and that displacement that takes place as a result of the slave trade and slavery, and all of that, how that entrains certain relationships to time, and certain difficult relationships and complex relationships to time. There's a a lot of questing, a lot of searching, but there's also attempts to recreate certain rhythms of time that might have been lost, ancestral rhythms, even within the framework of enslavement. We mustn't forget that as well, and all of those, the rituals, ceremonies, but just the traditions that
You mean
people carry with them.
that go further back? That go further back? You mean from the time of before enslavement? You mean, or
Yes, exactly. So, the descendants of enslaved people tried to reconnect with the sort of the time senses that they might have lost as a result of that displacement.
yes,
So I'm interested in that because I'm interested in how even our relationships to plants and the living world come to play in that as well, in terms of our attempts to preserve or recreate or sort of be back in touch with healing practices with just the way we just the way we try to realign our relationship with with the
Yes.
living world and the more than human world.
I mean, it's just thinking about the healing practices. I'm very conscious of, things my parents and grandparents have told me about, healing properties of things, and
Exactly.
turmeric, or I think coltsfoot at School of Flower, which it goes a bit jelly-like when you put water in it, or they very much grew up with this law and this relationship with the natural world of thinking about the heat and the cold of different foods and properties, the different, they thought about these powers in the natural world, and had ways of living which were drawing on those traditions, which I'm interested in, and I find comforting. I find it very comforting too. Those.
Exactly. So there's all of that. Yeah, and there's lots of that where I'm from as well, in Jamaica.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I realize we've been talking for a little while now.
Sorry, I feel it's a nice chat.
Yeah, we could go on for much longer. But I should probably read a few more poems and then turn it over to you
to hear some.
to read a few more as well.
Great, sure. I'll read some more. That would be great. Okay. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So
I'll mute.
Just I'm going to read a poem called Walking with the Word Tree. So, walking with the word tree. To have money is to have time. To have time is to have the forests and the trees. I look at my baby mind sliding in the sticky film of the bud, rubbing her thoughts between fingers and knowing the purple lips of the involucres in her mouth. And me, am I living my childhood all over again? For her, a wood will not be burnt for fire coal, where the pig pen is, where you hide from your mama, where you escape from scolding and rolling eyes, where the duppies live, where the madman lives, where wild animals, stray dogs, and the unwanted go to die. And me, am I living my childhood all over again? A child's way of pinching flowers, a child's way of touching buds. But what I had never known, this way of listening to the forest. Did Daisy, Miss Patsy's 11th child and my playmate, even know her name was a flower? In Porus, life was unpastoral. The woodland was there not for living in, going for walks or thinking. Trees were answers to our needs, not objects of desire. Wood fire. Catch butterflies along the way to grandmother on the other side of the yam field. Just don't do something foolish, like lose the money, or take too long so the pot don't cook before daddy reach home. Pardon. So the pot don't cook. I'll have to go to my. So the pot don't cook before daddy reach home. There's a way of paying attention to plants, a way of listening to trees, a way to hold a flower in your hand now that I'm here in a park in England. And I stop when called by the pistils of a tree. There is something in the pink that speaks so clearly to me, saying, "Glad you stopped. I saw you from far away." I don't even know what they call it, but I want to know what it tells me about itself, its appearance with thousands of others on this tree that up to April seemed like death. Our parents and grandparents planted yams, potato slips, reaped tomatoes, carrots, and so on. Then market, then money, then food, then clothes, then shoes to go to school. Now I'm practicing a different way of being with the woods. Only, I try not to stray too far from the path. The daisies glitter at my feet. I wanted to show a photo. Forgot about that. Just a photo. It's a photo that I took in Coffee Grove, which is a place where I was born in central Jamaica, a parish called Manchester. And Coffee Grove is a little hillside district, farming district. I used to, as a kid, I was responsible for bringing the goats to pasture, tying out goats, as we say back home. And that's taken. This photo is taken from the property, from the piece of land that's ours. You might see it's the blurred background there, the blurred part of it. You might see the banana trees. I don't know if it's probably not big enough for you to see that, but it's an image of home. It's an image of. All right. Right now I'm standing beneath what used to be, I imagine, an impressive tree. Split down its bole, it has sprouted green leaves that will be rustling way into September. At its base, lying athwart the clearing, is the severed part. The color of brown has weathered to near grey, and the footfall of walkers has covered the wood with a layer of dust, and yet the part that has fallen among the spikenard and hungry shrubs surges out of death. The raspberries feed on its breath, and beetles thrive in the slurry middle where the bole rots. Listen, there is nothing as exhilarating as the feeling of life coming into you. Though people look suspiciously, stand and listen. Do not go anywhere. We have been the workers, just the workers. In the Congo, one man had a land almost 80 times the size of Belgium as his estate. We have been property. When I talk about reclaiming time, I'm just thinking about my body standing in the middle of this woodland and doing nothing. Nothing. I think a final one before I hand over to you again, Mina. And this one is called Fear of Men. Must we imagine the trees are dark night, the moonlit fields and woodlands, the banana leaves and their bizarre anthropomorphisms? Must we imagine the moon growing full and strolling in the sky, the clouds that suddenly veil the light, covering the earth in darkness? Must we imagine the moment a gust of wind shakes the branches, and when, awakened out of torpor, a patu begins to cry? Must we imagine silhouettes rising, gigantic and black, the involuntary step backward from a human shape, and the gasp one makes at the idea of a duppy? Must we imagine the night and its spirits? Must we imagine that, because of fear of roaming men, more than of duppies, imagining the night is all we will do? Do you think I have time for one more? Okay, I'll read another one because I realize, just looking at the time. Chocho walks. There is no doing here. The only activity is life, greedily glutting, assured of its forever self. Twigs fall in the silence of Coffee Grove, where hearing is just walking, your shadow blending with those of the vines. Mammy carried a machete in her hand, Spanish bill, to part the succulent weeds, to ask them to excuse us. The cutting and digging was for cocoa yams that we would roast in the afternoon sun. My machete was for feeling grown, a worker whose hands plow the soil. I cannot tell you the delight of coolness, the delight of walking under a chocho walk, of hiding for a child, becoming flesh of the leaves, walking with caterpillars on all fours, when all we had was a machete, yam sticks, and chocho walks. The grown-up boys had slingshots, made trucks from cardboard juice boxes, and real engineering was to build a handcart. I settled for avocado wagons and cars, avocado men, everything built from an avocado seed. The path that leads back into the Chocha Walk leads through the undergrowth of maple trees in Leeds. The light is different but the same. The setting sun that dapples the leaves is different, but the coolness is almost the same. The bird calls are different, but bird calls are nouns, and nouns are spirits giving you sounds you need to hear. Right, I'll leave it there. Over to you now, Mina.
Oh, thanks, Jason. I was enjoying listening. Now to read some few more poems just to tie together. Well, I was saying earlier, I'm interested in the relationship between nature and native, and the plants and creatures which arrive on these shores and are described as alien. And the next poem is about the common dandelion, which was carried across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World by settlers, and it was taken as a medicinal plant, dandelion, but it soon spread all the way across North America, where it's known as an invasive species. So it's a short poem. Empire of the Dandelion. Blowball, puffball, pissenlit, priest halo, sin in the grass. One tiny spore proliferates, an empire spread on air. Dandelion, blown across oceans by ill winds, weed and bitter remedy, chicoria, pissabet, bitterer, sail out. I'm just thinking, in that poem there are lots of the different names in different languages for dandelions, so connecting back to Jason's thinking about names and naming. The next poem I'm going to read is about another immigrant species. This is an oak gall wasp. I wanted to imagine how it was for this tiny emigrant arriving in this country, emerging into English light. They were brought here to serve us, these tiny creatures, brought here for their gall, the little galls which grow on these specific oak trees, which were ground up to make ink. Wasp. The wasp who makes no honey gave us ink. In early spring, oak galls appear, darkening in autumn, they gestate. Emerging into English light, this tiny emigrant was smuggled in Aleppo oak, an alien acorn. So many creatures migrate to these shores every year, and I wanted to think about the movements of people as part of a larger pattern of movement across time and across seasons. I wanted to think about these at the same scale, and the next poem is the opening poem of my new collection, and it opens up into exilic space. A red door opens into snow. What to leave behind? A bangle, gold, a pearl, an offering for the threshold left behind. I recently went to a wonderful bird sanctuary at Welney in Norfolk, and I saw the gathering of swans there, the local mute swans in their hundreds alongside the migrant hooper swans with their yellow and black bills. The Buick swans that usually make their way to these shores hadn't arrived this year. perhaps because of changes to the temperature and their food sources on the usual route, and also, unfortunately, because their migration lines cross over countries where swan hunting is a sport. This is a poem about another local bird, like the mute swan. You can hear it, if you're lucky, in the reed beds around Cambridge. But although they're native to these islands, they're also described in the Old Testament. So I suppose I felt a kind of kinship with this bird, the bittern, a bird which lives in the Middle East, where I was born, and near Cambridge, where I live now. Bittern. It thrives in brackish water where the sea has broken in marshes and on river banks, edges of solid ground. When danger comes, it imitates the reeds, sticking its head up straight and swaying in the wind. A nervous bird, more often heard than seen, its hollow boom was heard at night in ancient and in empty times, in Nineveh and Babylon. I don't know if I've got time for a couple more. If I do, I've got another Babylonian poem, which I'll just try and find. Just coming up, a poem that's this is a poem called Tinnitus in Nineveh. It's a poem linking back to that ancient time. Tinnitus in Nineveh. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh held many remedies. If the hands of a ghost seize on a man and his ears sing or whisper, stuff them with charms, fumigate with rue or frankincense, find a blacksmith or a poet to distract the gnat with clang of metal striking metal, chisel striking stone. This last poem I'm going to read is about a different kind of writing, much more ephemeral writing, not the stone tablets that have survived, but the writing that pink-foot geese make when they fly in formation across the skies, arriving here on the coast of Norfolk, coming in to land from Iceland every autumn. I think they're probably heading back north round about now. At the edge of England, dusk, across the sky, VMW, MVI, more foreign than Icelandic runes, the skein of geese is spelling out a secret song. Like sacred script I couldn't understand or sound, and if I mouthed it wrong, she'd pinch my hand. And then the sky calls out a wild, familiar cry, reminding us not to despair. Our fears are only wintering, like letters disappearing into sky. Thanks very much. There was a bit of I tripped a bit on the secret sacred, but maybe that's
Thank you so much, Mina and Jason, too, for these beautiful readings and reflections. It's just been such a pleasure to sit back and listen to you both. I have some questions that I wanted to ask you both, but we also have questions from our audiences, so I thought I'd just field those first. And a quick reminder to anyone that's watching, if you have any last minute thoughts or things that you wanted to pose to both Jason or Mina, please just pop that in the chat. But to start us off, we have a question from Rose Torti, which is a question to both of you. They ask, what do you hope is the impact of your writing on the world? Do you see it as a part of a social or artistic movement? And she also says, thank you both. It was really amazing.
Oh,
I'm happy to say, give my thoughts if social or art. I think it's a bit of both. It's both for me. I really hope that my art could help be part of a some community creation of community and therefore a social space. So so that it could bring together people around the thinking about ecology and how we live in relation to the living world. I think, I mean, pedagogy and teaching is often, is such a kind of perhaps a kind of dry kind of term very often, and it seems alienated from poetry, or at least that's how it's presented. But I really think that learning together is one of the things that's central to what I try to do, to what I'm at least proposing through my art. So that I would bring people together. The political, for me, I think politics through community and through sociality. That's my approach to the political, because I think that's ultimately how thought revolutions will happen, or at least if it can affect the thinking of some people. Yeah, that's where I see my place. I don't know, what's your take on the issue, Mina?
well, yeah, I mean, I think I would like my poems to have some kind of restorative effect and to encourage people to connect to what's precious and the energies of the world around them, to tune in to the frequencies of where we're standing and be in the world, I think, and to recognize that in language we have a precious place to be as well, and that, yeah, so to think about those connections, the richness of the world around us. I mean, it sounds kind of, I mean it, I really think, especially at times of conflict, at times of suffering, the solace of what the earth can offer us and of what the language can offer us is very important, and the comfort of it. It's not to say that the poems are always comforting, but there's something, a place to be and a place that reminds us of our place too, and to think about that, I hope, well, they will do. Yeah, I think that's
perhaps just as a kind of follow-up comment from that, so many of your poems and texts from both of you center sort of nature as a space from which to learn and listen and think. And Jason, in one of the poems you shared, you say the landscape within me. And I just wondered if kind of a follow-up question might be, if you could talk a bit about the relations of nature and a kind of writing from or writing with rather than a writing about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so much of my work is thinking about the writing, what happens when you place your body into the space. What does that sensual connection generate, you know? It's I think I don't have a very articulated answer to the question, but writing from spaces, and seeing seeing the places that we write about as you know, that those somatic connections as really being part of our bodies, really being part of us. I suppose the message is there that art and this kind of poetry is also about the body. I think that's really where it lies. I think that's the point. That it's that writing about nature, quote unquote, is also writing about the body, and thinking about the body in all the ways, in all the different ways that we can do that. Not abstracting the body, but really seeing it as a part of the ecology that we are writing about. So we're writing about ourselves, in writing about mushrooms and the whole lot, and you know, all of that, and it's that ethical connection about what's the status of being a body then, in the world. So I think if the poetry has any power, it's also about thinking about poetry through that lens. That it's a kind of thing that puts us into this haptic sensed connection with our bodies and the responsibilities that we have that entrains. And if that can be passed on, if that can somehow be transmitted through the work, then possibly, you know, that can be the most powerful thing.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions from Helena Hunter. First off, Mina, can you talk more about writing with scale and how this operates, perhaps as a methodology in your work? And to Jason, thinking, writing, being with trees, where has this taken you with your writing? What might you have learned from trees? How may they have shaped or shifted your work?
Well, yeah, and scale is really the thing which has been structuring my thinking over the past couple of years when I've been pulling together the poems for this collection, and I've been very conscious of, I suppose, the shrinking of the world during lockdown and the way things became smaller, and our desire for things to be bigger, and so at some level that's to do with it, but also you know, the way that our imaginations can take us, and transcend scales, move between scales. So I tried to write poems which were exploring things at different scales, so millipedes or little tiny insects, but also constellations in space, planets, and to put the poems in juxtaposition in the collection so that the reader gets the experience of shifting scales like that a little bit. And some of the poems do that within them, that move between huge and tiny often, but also temperature scales. I'm very interested in kind of tiny, that the incremental shifts in temperature, which we know are going to have a huge, impact on our place in the world. These tiny, how is it to understand that scale how is it to understand that tiny scale, which is so important? So I'm trying to think across different scales of space, but also of temperature, tiny scales of hot and cold, and also shades of color scales. So I'm really interested in kinds of chromatography and trying, if you see, I don't know if you did that in school, where you put the ink and it's separated out into all its constituent colors up the blotting paper. I don't know if did that, but there's the breaking down of things into a kind of scale, wider scale. So what looked like it was dark blue ink opens into something much more varied and colourful. So I was interested in those tiny shifts like that, to see how much space and how much colour and how much variety there was in something that looked like a small singular thing, that it could open out and be a much more capacious and general, in a way, so thing. And maybe that's partly an invitation to see things in their richness, in their fullness, and not just so maybe there's some kind of I don't know, it's not politics, but invitation to explore the generosity of things by understanding how, if we see them in that way on different scales, they open up and are so much more than they seem. So I was interested in that, and the way we adapt to different scales, how human beings are resilient and can adapt to different scales of temperature, for example, or different, just to think about that as well. And I was fascinated by the creatures that can live in these extreme conditions, like at the bottom of the Arctic or at the vents of submarine volcanoes, like extremely hot and extremely cold conditions. That in these terrible conditions, life is possible, that, things are able to survive at these extreme scales. So what's the scale at which we can survive and thrive at what animals' life? And also, at what scale at what scale does it cease to matter what national boundaries cease to matter? At what scale does nation cease to matter? At what scale, when we look at ourselves in the world, are we at home in it and not, part of a smaller configuration on a map, for example? So I'm thinking about scales of belonging also. So I don't know if that answers your question. Those were the things I was interested in, and those were the questions which were coming up for me when I wrote the poems. I tried to articulate and work through, and I don't know, I hope the poems do that a little bit. Thanks for the question.
The question for me was about what lessons I've learned from trees. Was that it?
Yeah, so thinking, writing, being with trees. Where has this taken you with your writing? What might you have learned from trees, and how may they have shaped or shifted your work?
Well, it's shifted my work in, first of all, in that I've begun to think about thinking so much, which I never used to do before. And also, secondly, I've begun to think about poetry so much, and what poetry is, and how I am and can be involved in it. The different forms that it takes. And it's all because, you know, if trees send so much energy to us, and if they, you know, if we can hear and feel things that can't be put into words, then I've been thinking that it reframes this business of thinking, as, you know, as something that involves only our agency alone. You know, and the sense of rational control, so that it perhaps creates a space for sounds and soundings and vibrations which are felt, which are the felt, which, you know, that's the felt thing, and then perhaps we might be able to teach and learn and share more around sound and vibrations. And that might generate a different, you know, different different experiences of love, but not love in a wishy-washy sentimentalist sense, but, you know, that deep sense of that deep sense of politics of love, which I think is the most important politics for the current time.
Yes.
I think trees entrain in my mind the sense of the possibility of affect having a bigger place in how we share and learn and think. And of course affect goes beyond language. It exceeds, you know, articulated language and rational control, but we all feel it, and we all know that it's there, and we all can relate. We all know about the energies that affect produces, but it can't be mapped and controlled in that rationalist sense. But I suppose, yeah, there needs to be, I would think, thinking about the felt aspect of thinking, if that makes sense. The felt, the energy of thinking, as opposed to the abstract cognitive rationality of thinking.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, but before we wrap up, I just want to say a huge thank you again to you both, for so generously sharing your work, but also for joining in conversation and engaging our audiences. It's been such a pleasure. I'd also like to quickly thank Sarah and Linda as well for their collaboration developing the event, and also to my colleagues Jim, Helen and Catherine for their support. A word of thank you as well to Nottingham Trent University and the University of Nottingham for supporting our events. And finally, I'd just like to invite you all to the next Five Bodies live reading, which will take place on Thursday, the 14th of April. And we'll be joined by artist and poet Ryndon Johnson, alongside critical theorist and filmmaker Elizabeth Povinelli. So I hope to see you all then. But a huge thanks again, Jason and Mina.
Thanks, Olivia, for organizing, and the entire team behind it. Thanks so much.